Hey, y'all. As a growing family, my husband and I love game night, especially when it's Wayfair edition.
Let's do it. You gotta name as many Wayfair furniture and decor categories as you can. Ready? Go.
Sofas, bar stools, beds, ottomans, outdoor seating, bookshelves, kitchen tables, garden sheds, mid-century modern lamps.
Time. Nice. You got 9 out of a lot. Not too bad. Keep practicing by visiting wayfair.com, where you can shop every style for every home.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
This is episode 59 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Bate, Professor of English Literature and author of The Genius of Shakespeare. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Childish and simple-minded, but whether he was or not, didn't stop him from venting his anger against his father-in-law by bringing this court case, and he unleashed a tirade of accusations that Bott was void of all honesty, fidelity, or fear of God, and that he was an adulterer, a felon, a whoremonger, and a man who preyed on many gentlemen to disinherit them. As you can see, he was not too pleased about his wife being murdered.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
After William Shakespeare made his name in London, he established himself as a gentleman at home, acquiring not only a coat of arms, but the second largest house in town. New Place was brought with considerable legal wranglings, however, and the story of how Shakespeare came to own his famous house is filled with fights, suspicion, murder, and even a few ghost stories. It's a tale fit for a playwright, and here to share the story with us is the man who wrote the book on the Shakespeare history of Stratford-upon-Avon, the author of Shakespeare's Country Families, Mr. John Taplin. John's book represents over a decade worth of what he calls sifting through many a quiet archive shelf, combing over documents, records, and legal language to piece together the story of Shakespeare's life from the little details a shrewd historical investigator like John can uncover with enough patience to sort it out. John began working with Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in 2002, where his inspiration for this project first began. Now a successful author about Shakespeare, John regularly contributes articles and scholarly research to the Shakespeare history community. We are delighted he has agreed to share some of his time with us today. Hello, John. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Cassidy. Thank you for inviting me on it.
John, your book outlines the ownership of New Place as starting with a family called the Cloptons. Did they come to hold possession of New Place in the late 1560s prior to William Shakespeare's birth?
Well, in fact, the Cloptons were responsible for the building of New Place itself. A man called Hugh Clopton was a wealthy London mercer, but he came from Stratford. He was a great benefactor to the town. He built a number of things. He built in the church, he built the transept in the church, he built the bridge across the river, which we still have today, the Clopton Bridge, and he built himself a house in the town, which Leyland described around 1540 as a pretty house of brick and timber. He died in London in 1496. He didn't marry, and he left the house to his great nephew, a man called William Clopton. But the main Clopton house, the residence of the Cloptons, was a big house just outside Stratford, about a mile out of the town centre. So Hugh himself may have spent much of his time in that house rather than necessarily in the house that became known as New Place.
There was an issue related to the ownership of New Place concerning a lawyer named Bott, who John writes was of dubious character and known for somewhat sketchy methods of conducting legal transactions. John, did Bott steal New Place out from under the Cloptons?
Well, Cassidy, whether we can say that he stole the house is somewhat arguable, but it would appear that whilst he was acting as the Cloptons' agent, he was involved in some dishonesty with his dealings with the client's property. By 1549, New Place had suffered considerably from the neglect of the tenants that had been living in the house, although it was still owned, of course, by the Cloptons, and particularly one Thomas Bentley, who was a doctor. And after his death and his wife's remarriage, the lease on New Place became forfeit. And William Clopton's son, another William, who'd inherited the house, took it back into his possession. But William Jr. spent much of his time abroad, and he entrusted the care of New Place and other of his possessions to his agent, a man called William Bott. Now, Bott came from Snitterfield. Snitterfield's a little village just outside Stratford, about 3 or 4 miles away. He actually knew Richard Shakespeare, who was John Shakespeare's father. He'd farmed, and Bott knew him well. In fact, they were together on a couple of inventories of wills whilst he lived in Snitterfield. He was involved in a number of sort of legal wrangles. He was answer to a slander charge. He claimed to be a man of great honesty, that he'd lost a lot of money because he'd been helping people out, in his words. He thought he was doing them a favour, but it was always in the background that he was perhaps hanging on to their money and not being totally honest with them. And he had this unsavoury reputation too for oppressing the poor or poorer people, even confiscating cattle from some men. In 1564, there was a court case brought in the Star Chamber. You may have heard of the Star Chamber. And it was brought by his son-in-law, a man called John Harper. William Clopton testified in this case, and he said that while he was in Italy, Bott had taken the rents of his properties and held on to them. And perhaps more significantly, that he'd forged a document. We think that this document was principally concerned with New Place, and that in some way Bott had managed to wrangle the house away from young William. He actually stayed in the house. He was already living in the house at that time, and he was still there in 1567 when he himself sold the house to a man called William Underhill.
Well, John writes that Bott was expelled from his seat as alderman in 1565. Was Bott expelled from his seat based on how he handled this Clopton New Place ownership transaction? Did these scandal reports cause him to be cast in doubt in that role?
Well, that may have been a part of it, Cassidy, but there were probably other factors too. Corporations like Stratford's were founded by a Royal Charter of Incorporation that gave the residents considerable power over the governance of their boroughs. In this case, the charter was granted by Edward VI, the boy king, in 1553, just before his death, in fact. These corporations generally consisted of a 2-tier structure, formed men of substance and property, the burgesses in the town. In Stratford, there were 14 of what were described as the better and more honest and discreet inhabitants, and they were named as aldermen, who then chose 14 other people, who were called the capital burgesses, to form what was to be together to be the common council of the corporation. And each year in September, just before Michaelmas, they elected one of their number to be bailiff, or sometimes called high bailiff, and that was a position that later on became known as mayor. And they had another man who was also his deputy, called the high alderman. But it's interesting to note that sometimes these better and honest and discreet individuals were not above themselves getting into trouble. For example, in 1559, Alderman Richard Simmons was fined for allowing his ducks and pigs to wander the streets, no doubt causing an awful mess and making a nuisance of themselves. And the local brewer, a man called Richard Perrott, who was high bailiff at the time, was fined for making and selling unwholesome beer.
Oh, no.
Yes, I'm afraid so. Nothing changes very much. And of course, John Shakespeare himself was fined in 1552 for leaving a muck heap outside his property in Henley Street.
Wow.
We have to take them all with a little bit of pinch of salt in terms of what we tend to think of people in those days, but they were just like us, I guess. They got into a bit of trouble on occasions.
Yeah, so it kind of, taking it with a grain of salt sounds wise, I think. But who took his seat once it was vacated?
Well, that was taken by this man, William Bott. Now, Bott had no other experience at the time of municipal government or indeed any service. Very unusual to be voted onto the corporation with no previous background of local service to the corporation. And that was in 1564. And that was even despite the rumours that had been doing the rounds earlier of his efforts to deprive young William Clopton of his inheritance. Remember that? And also the events that had been surrounding the events of the death of his daughter. Bot's daughter had died the previous year under very suspicious circumstances. His sojourn on the council didn't last very long. The following year, in May 1605, he was called before the corporation to answer charges that he'd slandered the bailiff and the corporation, claiming that there was not an honest man amongst them. He certainly seems to have been a very unpleasant man and something of a bully. In fact, John Walsing of Exhall, a little village just outside Stratford, he also gave evidence against Bott in the Harper case. And he stated that only Mr. Underhill, remember he was the man who eventually bought New Place, was able to prevent Bott's malicious dealings with poor men. Bott actually failed to turn up when he was summoned to the council to answer these charges, and he was summarily dispatched and expelled from the corporation. So that is what provided the opening for John Shakespeare to move in and become an alderman.
Wow. Okay. So William Shakespeare's dad took Bott's place once he was expelled from the corporation.
Yeah.
Well, do you think later in life, when William Shakespeare was looking to buy New Place, that this experience, that he was quite young, I think, when it was going on, but his father might have told him about it. Do you think that played into his decision to buy this property later in life? I mean, it seems like he did have to go through several unusual hoops to obtain it.
Well, New Place was said to have been the second largest house in Stratford in Shakespeare's time, only behind the college in Old Town, which had been the home to the collegiate priests of Holy Trinity Church before the Reformation and the Dissolution. William would have been well aware of the history of the house and probably the goings-on there in his early childhood. But as he grew up, he would have passed the house on his way to school every day. It's just across the road from the Guildhall where the school was, and it in fact still is. Like most people, I suppose, he was keen to raise the status and prosperity of his family as he grew up himself. And whilst he spent his working life away from Stratford, his wife and children, of course, remained in the town. And as his financial position improved, he strove to do this by renewing his father's previously failed bid for a coat of arms in 1596, and the following year by purchasing his dream home of New Place. All of this, of course, whilst his father was still alive. So this achievement could be seen as in some way contributing towards the rehabilitation of his father in the town. Shakespeare bought New Place in the spring of 1597 from William Underhill, the son of the William Underhill who actually bought the house from Bott in 1567. However, matters were complicated by the untimely death of Underhill in July 1597. Certainly there is a document called an exemplification of the final concord of the purchase of New Place from William Underhill, which is dated on the 4th of May 1597. And this states that the price paid was £60, though we think this is probably more of a symbolic amount than the actual price, which was probably more like double that. The exemplification was normally accompanied by a deed of conveyance, as we have today, and that would have been more explicit in the details of the purchase of the property. But unfortunately, this hasn't survived, if it was ever produced, in fact. And the circumstances surrounding Underhill's death may have thrown some doubt on the completion of the deal on New Place, and that led to Shakespeare a few years later in 1602, at some additional expense, it must be said, obtaining a second exemplification for the purchase. So that was additional proof, if it should be needed, of his ownership of the property and his purchase of it. And he obtained this from the surviving son of William Underhill, who was called Hercules Underhill. And when he reached his majority, he was able to do that with Shakespeare.
That's quite a lot of pains to go through to make sure there's no question of his ownership of the property.
Yeah, I suppose in some ways, Shakespeare, as a new gentleman, shall we say, a new member of this particular level of society in England at the time, he may have been showing off a little bit by getting a splendid document that he could produce and show to his friends, just to prove that I do own the second biggest house in Stratford.
we should point out that when we say New Place is still right down the street from the schoolhouse, we don't mean the actual building, but you can see the spot where it was. And I will put pictures that I took on my last trip to Stratford-upon-Avon, where you can see kind of that's right down the street. If you haven't been to that area of the country, you can see what we're talking about in the proximity there. So make sure you check the show notes to see where that's at. Now, Bott nor his family, John, had maintained the ownership of New Place, as you just outlined for us, when it was purchased by the Underhills in 1567. This must have been a notable event for William Shakespeare. And you write that the lawyer Bott is considered by local tradition to be a murderer. And this was so shocking to me. Tell us about what happened to give Bott the reputation of being a murderer, and what local traditions you were citing when you made this claim about him.
Okay. Well, as I said, Bott was considered to be an untrustworthy man, and his dubious dealings with William Clopton himself was not actually a one-off. He had a daughter called Isabella, and Bott engineered her marriage to the man John Harper. Remember I mentioned him?
I do. Okay.
Now, Harper he would have been a minor at the time. He was under 21. And it was always a bit dangerous for people that inherited anything as a child or as a minor, because they very often had to have some sort of a guardian to look after their affairs. But Bott decided that he would get his daughter, Isabella, married off to young Harper. Once he'd done this, he then, by a series of fraudulent actions, in which we think his daughter actually conspired at some stage, he managed to get the young man to sign up to the fact that should his daughter die, in other words, Harper's wife, should she die childless, then all of Harper's property and his inheritance would come his. I don't know whether his daughter thought about it when she helped her father with this, because it wasn't a particularly pleasant outlook for him to get the property, which would have resulted in her death. In fact, this was what provided the motive for Bott's murder of his daughter. He and his second wife conspired together to administer the poor girl a fatal dose of rat poison. She was very soon passed away, and in fact was buried in Holy Trinity on the 7th of May, 1563. And the following year, this is when John Harper brought the case against Bott. He was said to have been a childish and simple-minded man, plain and simple-minded was the way he was described. But whether he was or not, it didn't stop him from venting his anger against his father-in-law by bringing this court case, and he unleashed a tirade of accusations that Bott was void of all honesty, fidelity, or fear of God, and that he was an adulterer, a felon, a whoremonger, and a man who preyed on many gentlemen to disinherit them. So, as you can see, he was not too pleased about his wife being murdered. The crime, it seems, had not gone unobserved. 8 years later, a shoemaker here in Stratford, a man called Roland Wheeler, gave testimony that he'd been actually present when Bott and his wife administered the poison to.
He was a witness?
So he says. And he said that they gave it to the rat poison on a spoon, which they afterwards hid under a green carpet. I don't know if he was just embellishing it to make it sound more truthful. And he even claimed that Bott's first wife, Isabella's mother, was still alive, making Bott a bigamist too. So, just adding
gracious
to the crimes of the man. Now, whether Wheeler is in fact correct in his claims, we perhaps have to be a little bit careful, because he and Bott had some form with one another. They brought cases against each other previously where Wheeler had slandered Bott and actually been fined for doing so. In fact, Bott was never charged with the crime. So I think we've got to be a little bit careful with Wheeler's claims. The case against Bott, you asked where all this information seemed to come from, whether it's just hearsay or what. The case against Bott was first illuminated by the work of a man called Edward Tanguy Lean, who in fact was the younger brother of David Lean, the movie producer. His investigations were followed up by a famous American Shakespeare scholar, Samuel Schoenbaum, who actually found some documents in the State Papers Domestic in the Public Record Office, which is now the National Archive, dated June 1571, and which he described in a chapter of a 1989 book called Shakespeare Text Context, edited by a man called his name is Roland Dotterer. But Germaine Greer also relates pretty much the same events in her 2007 book, Shakespeare's Wife. So that's where we get a little bit more of the factual rather than the myth, shall we say.
Well, okay. So, but does this mean when William Shakespeare goes to buy this house that he's now buying a haunted house?
Well, that's an interesting observation, Cassidy. I don't know if Shakespeare was a psychic or whether he believed in ghosts, but in fact, there are reports of a ghost of a lady at Hall's Croft, the former home of John Hall and his wife Susanna. And there's also a tradition that the ghost of Bott's murdered daughter used to wander in the grounds of New Place. In fact, a former colleague of mine who was sensitive to these sorts of things certainly felt that there was a spiritual presence at Nash's house, which is adjacent to New Place. Though in all my years there, I have to say that I never had any such feelings. Maybe I'm not tuned into these things. But Shakespeare, of course, has several ghosts appearing in his works, with the ghost of his father in Hamlet, the ghosts that appeared in a dream to Richard III on the eve of Bosworth, the ghost of Caesar, of course, appearing to Brutus, and Banquo's ghost in Macbeth. And other plays that appeared also had ghost suspects in them. So certainly we know that many people at the time did believe in apparitions, and there was a strong belief then, of course, in the afterlife and the resurrection on the final day of judgment. So perhaps such beliefs were probably held by far more people then than they are now.
Well, what ultimately happened to William Underhill and his oldest son? Is it pronounced Fulk?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. What happened to them?
Well, William Underhill was reputedly poisoned at a place called Fillongley, which is just outside Coventry. It's actually part of Coventry these days, really. He made an oral, or proper word is a non-cupative will, on the 6th of July, 1597, and he died the following day. He left the bulk of his estate in this non-cupative will to his eldest son, Fulk. However, shortly afterwards, suspicion fell on Fulk that he'd actually poisoned his father. He was reputedly subsequently tried and hanged at Warwick for his crime in 1599. Now, there is another account, in fact, that says that Fulk wasn't actually hung and that he died in 1598, so like a year earlier. There is actually also a record that the great bell at Warwick St Mary's Church was tolled for his death. So it does leave a little bit of doubt about this story of his being hung. But in another one of these ghostly traditions, it's said that the ghost of William, the father, is said to have wandered around their home at Idlicott, lamenting the evil actions of his son against him. So,
wow,
it's a beautiful place too. I've been to Idlicott. It certainly has a feel about it. You can just imagine the ghost of
where those stories came from. Certainly. Now, John, you write about the drama and the history here of the Clopton family and it circling back to impact Shakespeare's history. And all of that certainly makes sense that it's certainly dramatic. It makes sense to think that some of it would have inspired the plot lines in Shakespeare's plays. But you specifically point out Ophelia and Juliet as characters you think might be connected to some of this drama we're discussing today. Can you explain how you think that might be connected?
The Cloptons' involvement in the New Place, as I mentioned, began with Hugh Clopton, its builder, and ended firstly with the business of the disputed sale by William Clopton to Bott in 1563. However, this was not to be their last involvement with the house, because after Shakespeare's purchase of New Place in 1597, the house stayed within his family after his death in 1616, firstly being Susanna and John Hall's home, and of course her mother would have stayed there until her death in 1623. After Susanna's death, she died in 1649, the house passed to her daughter, Elizabeth, the only child that John Hall and Susanna had. But again, this was not without some some considerable legal problems. That's another story. And Elizabeth herself, Shakespeare's granddaughter, married twice. Her first husband, a man called Thomas Nash, died in 1647. And 2 years later, she married a man called John Bernard, who came from a place called Abington Manor in Northampton. And he was later knighted by Charles II. And although she lived the rest of her life at Abington, she retained New Place Estate until her death in 1670. It then stayed with John Bernard until he died a few years later in 1674, after which it was sold out of the family. And it was bought by a man called Sir Edward Walker. Walker had an interesting career, in fact. He'd been secretary to Charles I during the English Civil War. And he bought the house. His daughter, Barbara, had married one of the Cloptons, Sir John Clopton. And so once Walker died, then the house reverted through that marriage to the Cloptons again. So, in fact, it came full circle.
So it came back.
Yeah. After the death of Sir Edward Walker, he only had the house for about a year. After his death, of course, it passed to his daughter, and the way things worked in those days, the wife's property eventually went to the husband. So that's how the Cloptons got it back again.
With all this rich Shakespeare history connected to the property, why is New Place not still standing there today?
The house that Shakespeare had as New Place was demolished by the same Sir John Clopton, the man who married Walker's daughter Barbara, and his son. Ironically, his son was called Hugh. So the first man who bought it was Hugh, and the man who helped knock it down was also Hugh. And that was around 1700. And they replaced it with what I guess we would describe as a William and Mary style townhouse. Quite a smart place it would have been. And Sir John Clopton gave that house as a wedding present to Hugh on his marriage in 1702 to a woman called Elizabeth Millward. Perhaps surprisingly, the destruction of Shakespeare's New Place and its replacement seems to have raised little comment locally at the time. But this may just be a reflection of the interest that in Shakespeare the man that was to ignite later in the 18th century yet to happen. The house that replaced it was not to survive long very either. The owner, in 1759, was a man called Francis Gastrell, who was a vicar. He was a newcomer to Stratford. He doesn't seem to have been liked very much right from the outset. And he had a tax dispute, of all things, with the Stratford Corporation. In sort of a pique, I suppose, of anger, he had the house demolished, and he and his wife left Stratford. In fact, it caused quite an outcry at the time, and they were effectively, I suppose, run out of town. But again, that's another story, I suppose.
I have read that they were run out of town because they destroyed the house and people were so angry about it. Is there truth to that, or is that embellished by Shakespeare fans?
Well, I think there is some truth in that, yes, because by this time, interest in Shakespeare had increased quite dramatically from the beginning of the 18th century. And of course, it was only a few years later that Garrick came to Stratford and had his Jubilee Festival. So there would certainly, in the 1750s, there would have been a lot more interest in what was going on. I mean, there'd been publications in the 18th century, several publications of Shakespeare's works again, following the three publications of the folio, in the 17th century. So there was a lot more interest starting to sprout in terms of finding more about the man as opposed to simply his works. So there were people coming to Stratford by this time, trying to find out more about where Shakespeare had been born, where he lived, any stories about him. So yes, I think there would have been quite an outcry at the time.
Well, I know that this is fascinating and we could study this quite extensively, as you have done to produce your excellent book. I would love it if you could tell us briefly about your book and where we can get a copy, but then also share with us what are some of your recommended resources that you think we should use to explore further.
Okay, my book is only available on Amazon these days. It was produced in a limited number of copies. There are still some copies available in bookshops in Stratford, but obviously that's limited for people outside of the town.
Or a great reason to travel to Stratford.
Or indeed, yes. I don't think I'll get too much credit from the Shakespeare Tourism Board. But specifically on Shakespeare and his property here in Stratford, I think a good start would be a little book, very easy to read, It's by a man called Robert Bierman, who used to be the senior archivist at the Birthplace Trust, and certainly a great expert on all things Shakespeare in the records. The book is called Shakespeare in the Stratford Records, and for those interested perhaps in the archaeological search for Shakespeare's new place, the 2016 book, Finding Shakespeare's New Place, an Archaeological Biography, will give an up-to-date perspective on the house following the 3-season archaeological dig that I was involved in actually as one of the academic team.
Were you? Oh, that's neat.
Yeah.
And who's the official, is that a group authorship there?
Yes, it was under one of your previous contributors, Paul Edmondson.
I was wondering if that's the one you were referencing. So yeah, excellent. Well, we will link to both of those in the show notes for today's episode. Thank you for those recommendations. Yeah. We asked. I'm sorry.
I was going to add a little bit more if you want, because
yes, I do.
On a more general note, I think anyone who is new to Shakespeare biography would do well to visit some of the writers of going back a while now, even the 18th, 19th, and early part of the 20th century. People like Edmund Malone, James Orchard Halliwell Phillips, Charlotte Stopes, whose daughter, of course, was the famous lady that brought about a lot of interest in contraception. You've heard of Mary Stopes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sidney Lee, of course, Edmund Chambers, American, Leslie Hobson, one of my heroes. The A.B. Bernard, and, of course, Samuel Schulbaum, and another one of my American heroes, Mark Eccles, most of whom I discuss in the early part of my book. And also antiquarian writers like Edgar Fripp. But for more recent writers, I'd recommend, particularly with the interest in alternative Shakespeare's, I'd recommend John Mitchell's book on the Shakespeare authorship controversy, which is very good. Michael Wood and Bill Bryson, of course, for their readability. There's so much that you could actually talk about in terms of books that are available. But I think if you're really serious and want some more scholarly treatises, then people like Jonathan Bates, Stanley Wells, I've mentioned Robert Bierman, and two of your previous guests, of course, Paul Edmondson and Glyn Parry. As I say, this is only scratching the surface. And it really depends on the interest of the individual reader.
That is just a wealth of great sources to check out for sure. I've read several of the ones that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Love Edmund Chambers, and certainly Bill Bryson is, as you say, readable. I'm not personally a fan of the authorship controversy, but I'll allow it.
No, but it's a very, very well balanced review of it, which I think is always good to get both sides of the argument.
We're all about balance. Well, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Right, okay. Now, I hope I'm not going to cheat here, because I'm going to ask for more than one book, because what I would like to take on my desert island would be the works of Dennis Wheatley, and in particular the Roger Brooks stories. I read them many years ago when I used to have the long commute by train each day, and they left a lasting impression on me as wonderful historical novels. My second choice is also not a single book, but I hope you'll indulge me, and I'd like to take Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Again, these are books I read a long time ago, but whenever I pick up Churchill's books, I'm amazed at the level of clarity his histories provide, and they're still fresh, even after several decades.
Excellent choices for sure. And yes, absolutely. You can take two. It's your deserted island, so you can pick. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, recently I've been revisiting my research into Shakespeare's son-in-law, the physician John Hall.
Yes.
For years, the ancestry of John Hall was speculative. It was based on circumstantial rather than documentary evidence, albeit that the substantial evidence was quite compelling. This I partially resolved in the research I did when I published my book in 2011, and I finally resolved it conclusively in research in the book that I published last year. So this is the one I'm talking about that's on Amazon now. And I'm also examining aspects of the inheritance that John received from his father and how this played out with his elder brother, Dive Hall, and other members of the family who disputed the ownership of the property. I know that some of the documentation for this has been found before. I don't think it's ever been properly analysed. So I'm doing that at the moment.
That's
and
fascinating.
It throws quite an interesting human light on these people. And I think it, perhaps for me at least, has changed my perception of the relationship between John and his brother Dive, which a lot of people have assumed really just from the will of their father, where Dive is rather denigrated by his father, not given the executiveship of the will, if that was given to John. But I think this later research is showing that they were actually on reasonably good terms. In fact, John helped Dive quite substantially for the rest of his life. So that's something that's quite interesting. I'm also looking at connections of two families called Hewings, one which comes from a village called Bretforton, which is in Worcestershire, and the other which came from Bearley, which is a little village near Wilmcote, was Mary Arden's village. John Hewings of Bearley was the first husband of Agnes Webb, who later married Robert Arden and became Mary Arden's stepmother. John Hewings of Bretforton married a woman called Alice Harwood, who, in my book, I make a case for her being the cousin of Robert Harwood, a.k.a. Harvard. This man, I believe, was the father of John Harvard, the benefactor of your wonderful university at Harvard. And I'd also like to, if I can just add a bit more, I'd also like to look into the research that this man, Edward Tanguay-Lean, deposited with the Birthplace Trust here in Stratford. I think that may contain some interesting clues as to where we can go next with Shakespeare research.
You've really impressed upon me the importance and depth of things like property ownership documents and genealogies. I think it's easy to dismiss records like that for feeling they don't necessarily reveal details, but you've definitely shown me and demonstrated today just how useful it is to really get to know pieces of history, to study those records. And I'm impressed at how much you've gone through all of them to do this, and certainly for being here today to share with us your discoveries and your book. It's fascinating. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Well, thank you for having me. I'd just like to add perhaps that it's one of the reasons why I do this work is because I admire people like one of your other contributors, Dr. Parry, because I know that he has spent many hours in many dusty archives, and I'm convinced that there's still much more that awaits discovery in these places.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, John Taplin, author of Shakespeare's Country Families, for being here with us today. We've enjoyed this time with you.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Don't forget to stop by the show notes for today's episode and see the pictures of the schoolhouse and the distance between it and where New Place is located. I'll also share with you some of my trip pictures from Stratford-upon-Avon when I went, so you can see the quote on the gate at New Place, as well as links to all of the valuable resources that Mr. Taplin shared with us today. There is a wealth of information packed over there, including information about our brand new membership that we are launching, where you can study Shakespeare behind the episode, along with me in a hands-on way with activities and downloads and different things that you can use to experience Shakespeare's history for yourself. Find out more about that and all of the resources from today's episode at CassidyCash.com/episode 59. That's CassidyCash.com/EP59. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. I'm Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.